What's wrong with cheap food? Something I'm sure many of you will have asked if you've tried buying a sandwich here at the Barbican every Saturday. So, cheap food, destroyer of dairy farms, of poor quality in terms of taste and nutrition, and so cheap we happily waste it without thought for the environment, our wallets, or indeed our waistlines. Alternatively, some think cheap food is a good thing. Today we spend just 10% of our disposable income feeding ourselves as opposed to 30% 100 years or so ago. That allows us more disposable income to spend on other things that aren't simply about subsistence. And many argue it's a boon for the poorest in society, helped by gains in global agricultural productivity, which, if nothing else, will help feed the 9 billion of expected to exist by 2050. And beyond the environmental and economic debates, there's a cultural debate to be had, as we might ask why some of us scoff at those who seek cheap food and then discover they've accidentally been eating horse meat. We think that's hysterical. And yet we applaud wealthier individuals who are delighted by their Italian hazelnut ice cream from Lidl. That's my landlords, by the way, my former landlords. So there's a lot of kind of cultural stuff going on with the discussion of cheap food as well, beyond economics and the environment. We've got a lot to get through in just an hour, so without further delay, I'm going to introduce everyone. I should introduce myself, actually. I'm Justine Brian. I'm the director of the Institute of Ideas Debating Matters competition. That's a national sixth form debating competition. And I also have a personal private passion for anything related to food, which is why Rob asked me to chair this session. I'm very interested in food debates as well. I am delighted to introduce to you, on my right, we have Alex Renton, an award-winning journalist, writer on food and food policy, author of Planet Carnivore, How Cheap Meat Costs the Earth. He says he's the only former war correspondent to have become a food columnist, and this has got something to do with a really nice kebab somewhere in Iran. I'm fascinated by that. So, he writes, yeah, exactly. He writes on development, global poverty, and food, and his writings won him awards and commendations over the last 5 or 6 years. He's worked as a writer and editor at the Independent newspaper and the London Evening Standard before going on to work for Oxfam in East Asia. He now writes a weekly column, which is how I know Alex, for The Times and also for The Observer and Prospect magazine. He lives in Scotland and owns a remote pig. I don't know what a remote pig is.
It's a way of bringing out your own pig, but not actually having to have it in your garden so the neighbours don't get cross.
Brilliant.
It's down the road.
I might get a remote pig as well.
It's like a kid at boarding school.
Okay, fine. Do you get to eat it in the end?
Yes.
Oh, right, good. Alex is going to speak first. After Alex, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Andrew Opie on my far right here, geographically, not politically. He's the Director for Food and Sustainability at our partners for this session, the British Retail Consortium. They are the trade association for UK retailers, which includes all of our major food retailers. He and his team cover a wide range of regulatory and policy issues, including responsible sourcing and production, waste and ethical labour. Before the BRC, Andrew was head of policy services at the National Farmers Union and previously ran a dairy farm estate in Wiltshire. So welcome to Andrew. And speaking last on my left, we have Rob Lyons, who's a Science and Technology Director at the Institute of Ideas, my colleague at the Institute of Ideas. He's also a columnist for online magazine Spiked and author of Panic on a Plate, How Society Developed an Eating Disorder. He writes on a wide range of issues, but takes a particular interest in issues around the environment, food, energy, and risk. He's a frequent commentator on TV and radio, also works as the campaigns manager for Action on Consumer Choice, and is co-convener of the Institute of Ideas Economy Forum. So can we just have a big round of applause to welcome our three speakers? So our speakers are going to give you an opening introduction with some of their thoughts and ideas. Once they're all done, I'm coming straight out to you as the audience for questions and points. I want you to really quiz the speakers on what they say. So without further ado, Alex, over to you.
Thanks. The first thing you have to say at any session like this is I love food and have had, as you can see, a wonderful time playing around with it and enjoying it and sharing it with friends. The basic key human pleasure. And I've been allowed to do this, unlike the great bulk of my ancestors back into free history, without fear of starvation and with more choice than has ever been available to humankind before. And without having to spend 50, 60, 70% of my days hunting and looking for food, or fighting for food, or growing food, which remains the amount of time spent by quite a lot of people on the planet. I as a member of the global 1%, I'm incredibly lucky. I've had a wonderful time with food. And what an achievement. I mean, that our society has gone from this state of fear over starvation, over seeing our own children starve, of not living our days out, of rickets and so on, to this amazing plenty in excess. One of the most extraordinary things that has happened in modern times. But, as we all know, along with it come all sorts of problems. And the very fact that all these paradoxes cluster around modern food and modern food supply shows just how troubled our relationship now is with it. And we all know them. We say this session is about food being too cheap. You know, clearly food is cheaper to the great bulk of the Western developed world than it has ever been in history. But then equally, food is also hideously expensive. But these costs are hidden, picked up by the taxpayer, because we, consumer and the retailers, as Andrew knows, refuse to pick them up, and governments are prepared to do so. The costs, I'd argue that the hidden costs of food are rising very steeply because the demands of cheap food raise the hidden costs, because intensive production has all sorts of social and environmental costs that many of which we're handing on to the generations that come. And the other paradox, of course, and it would be very wrong not to acknowledge it, is that in this country of uniquely cheap food, cheapest in Europe, we have 500,000, 1 million people, depends on the statistics you believe, who regularly use food banks. So people for whom, even though food prices have dropped 2.5% this year in Britain, I suspect will never be able to afford the food they need to feed their families. Now, when we talked before about introducing this, I'd suggested to everyone that maybe we looked at milk, because the milk story was the latest big failure of the food system scandal, and they're all pretty much similar, to hit the headlines, and it was big this summer. So with the sort of remaining 2 minutes I probably have, and I think we can take this forward because we'll all have different views on it. In my view, milk sums it up very well. In that milk, staple food since the Middle Ages for everyone, for the white meats, the food particularly that fed growing urban populations, absolutely crucial. But it's become, to the modern retailer, something really totally unrelated to its production costs or indeed the uses it's put to. It's just a token. No one knows the price of milk. It can be anything between 40p a pint and 80p a pint, depending on what special offer's going on. And it was divorced quite deliberately 30 years ago from what really happened in the field and with the farmer by the ideologically driven destruction of the milk fixing systems, the milk marketing boards and so on. And since then, it's been a toy for retailers to play their games of promising you more value. Part of their great rush to take prices to the very bottom, and a rush which has become increasingly dishonest, which is why we see the scandals around labelling and so on. But so the side effects of it is so retailers fight over offering new bargains on a product that most of us don't care so little about price-wise because it's so cheap that we don't even know what the price of it is. But the knock-on effects, the hidden costs of this, are disastrous within all sorts of things that we don't really understand, but we love very much, like the beautiful British countryside, which was largely, or great parts of it, swathes of it, were built on the notion of small-scale dairy farming and the employment that would bring, and the very nature of a landscape that would be designed by it. Now, it's now become completely clear that cannot go on, that farms of 5,000, 10,000 cows are the only way forward because of this insane demand to keep the milk price low. And that's nothing, as we said, you'll be told that the 25% rise in the cost of milk this summer was to do with things going on way, way abroad. The Russians banning farm imports from Europe, the overall drop in commodity prices. It actually isn't. It's very plain, and Andrew, as a former dairy farmer, knows that
wasn't a farmer.
Manager.
Such, yeah, manager.
A manager.
Yeah.
that the price of milk 20 years ago to a farmer is pretty much what it was, what it is today. It's changed about 5p. The price of milk on the doorstep, if you can actually find a real price, the price of milk on the supermarket shelf has doubled because the retailer is now taking twice as much of that 80p bottle of milk as they did at the time when we still had price controls. So what you see, the side effects are of a collapse in a core industry in the country, the destruction of a rural economy, massive poverty among agricultural workers, and coming environmental damage because what large-scale 10,000 cows in a hut do to the landscape is something absolutely disgusting. And yet another situation where a product that sustained all parts of society usefully and helped feed the poor becomes something that we, the country that produce it, give away to foreigners, give away to other countries to get the value added. So that's one final point, which is that we are net exporters of milk and cream, but we import the valuable things, the things where a value can be added to the milk product, like cheese and butter. 60% of our butter is imported. So, and I'd argue that is because of years of low milk prices sucking the ability of the dairy industry to create value out of their product. So it's a sort of, I never want to use the phrase perfect storm, but it is a great pile of ill effects from beneficial effects which are really impossible to find whatsoever. No one benefits from having cheaper milk. Supermarkets certainly don't, and they're all on a race towards disaster in economic terms. But the knock-ons are just dreadful. And that applies to an awful lot of basic commodities throughout the food system.
Alex, thank you very much. Andrew.
Thanks. So is cheap food a good thing? Well, probably not when you put it like that. And most debates I turn up to, people talk about cheap food as if it, in a derogatory way. But actually, if you look what we've got in this country, we've got fantastically produced, affordable, nutritious food that's available to us all, and something that we all benefit from here. And the increasing affordability of food not only means that we can eat a better, wider range of products than our grandparents ever did, but it also means we've got more discretionary income to spend on other things. We have to spend on food, obviously, and therefore the fact that food has become more affordable has released more income for us to spend in other areas. So not only have we got a better food system than we've ever had, we've also got more discretionary income to spend on other things. And if you look at lower socioeconomic groups who, as Alex mentioned, for who food costs are a major part of their budget, declining food costs have made a big difference. In fact, if only we'd seen the same success in a supply chain around our utilities, or in fact, if our housing market reflected the food market, then lower income consumers would be much better off in this country than they are currently. The proportion of income we spend on food, we would say it'd be around 11%, 10%. We used to spend a third of our income on food in the 1950s. So it's been a huge success story in our food supply chain, from farmers right through to retailers, that we've been able to make that. And of course, what we've done in the same time, we've increased our expenditure on other things. We actually spend more on recreation and culture, about 13%, than we do on food now. So we've got great food, great nutritious food, but also we're enjoying ourselves more because we're spending more of our income on things that we enjoy. A more affordable food has opened up choice and variety for everyone. I think there's a lot of snobbery around food. You know, nowadays, it's really sparked a true revolution in food. Food that was enjoyed by the privileged few a few years ago, now it's available to everyone. Food that used to be seen as exotic or unavailable, it's in your local supermarket. Everybody has access to it. And it's been achieved primarily through efficiency, including the dairy industry and other sectors that supply us. We've seen massive increases in production and productivity in our agricultural sector. We've seen huge increases in the scale, which has helped our buying potential. And remember, we're in a global market here. And finally, the logistics, i.e. how we move food from a farm to us on the shelf, has improved enormously. And in such a competitive market, unlike some of the other markets I touched upon, those benefits are passed on to us as consumers. The margins that retailers charge here are very, very small, and the margins have been taken out and passed on to us as consumers. And at the same time, those production standards have increased, whether it's the regulatory increase. So remember, most of our food law, environmental law stems from Brussels. So you have that increase in regulation there, but also the increase in voluntary regulation that we've seen because us as consumers demand more from our food producers. So all I wanted to say is, will it last? Because obviously we have seen this great improvement in affordability over the years. Well, there's no doubt we're in a more volatile food market. Climate change, volatility of oil, commodity shocks will all impact on our supply chain, as they do with every other country around the world. We're in a global market, and we may see shocks like we saw in 2008, when we did see a relatively sharp increase in food prices. But I don't think that is the long-term future for food, for two reasons. First of all, unlike Alex, I'm much more confident in that the food companies that I speak to, manufacturers, farmers, retailers, are all looking at the long term. They're looking at the sustainability of issues. They're looking to take either those costs that are already in front of them, or the external costs which people talk about in food, coming into their business, and how do they manage it. Secondly, as consumers, I don't see us as consumers, particularly the 60 odd million that retailers serve every week, changing their approach to food. The pressure on value, particularly on price, which we've seen in the last decade, doesn't look like it's going to go away. And the message to everybody in the supply chain, retailers being at the particularly sharp end, is that you need to be able to meet consumer demand, or you will not stay in the market. So for me, apart from the suggestion that cheap food is in some way a derogatory thing, I think our food supply chain since the war has been one of the UK's big success stories, and the beneficiaries have been all of us as consumers.
Andrew, thank you very much. Rob.
Well, Alex and Andrew have done a very good job for me, so I'm now going to skip about 3 paragraphs of what I was going to say. You know, we are living in historically unprecedented times. We do live in a cornucopia where I think that even amongst the bottom 20% in terms of income in this country still only spend 16% of their household income on food. I mean, so it's a remarkable achievement that we've been sort of liberated from not first from the day-to-day grind of actually producing our own food, but now actually so little of our working time is required to pay for the food that we eat. And I think, therefore, it's actually the debate about cheap food, which Andrew just touched on, which is more of a problem. You know, so rather than being a matter of celebration that we have this the access to so much cheap food, it's now food has become a means of showing off your wealth or your virtue. So, I mean, companies do this, which I find odd. I don't know where the demand for it is coming from, but where you can actually see the farm and the farmer on your packet of whatever it is, whether it's tomatoes or bacon or whatever that were actually produced by, and we're willing to spend more on food if it's got a narrative behind it. That's actually seems to be a real trend now. It has to have metaphorical roots as well as physical roots. And we're told we should obsess about whether food is local or seasonal or organic or artisan, rather than whether it simply keeps body and soul together in a pleasurable way. And people can get very snobbish about these things and very dismissive of people who just have regular food. Nonetheless, actually, although I dislike that trend, I think it's a symptom of the fact that food is cheap. Actually, you can play with food. You can now have food that satisfies your political needs or your psychological needs or whatever sort of sociological message you want to send out to the world, because at the bottom line is you can eat very, very cheaply, and these displays or these political statements are easily affordable. But I want to look quickly at 3 particular problems with cheap food. And one of the benefits of working at the Institute of Ideas, you can set up sessions and then for yourself to speak at, which I've done here, frankly. But this session was actually inspired by a long article that Alex wrote in Newsweek about a year and a half ago, something like that, about basically saying, we should be paying more for our food. And I'm just going to pick up on three arguments that appear in that article, but they appear quite commonly elsewhere. As first of all, that food prices hurts farmers, which Alex has alluded to already, that food waste hurts the environment, and that cheap, poor quality food damages our health. So first on the farmers, I think there is a perfect storm going on. There are Russian exports. Russia has banned imports of EU food in the tit-for-tat exchange with the EU over Ukraine, and therefore all those Eastern European milk producers are now kind of flooding the market in Western Europe with their product. The Chinese aren't having so much powdered milk anymore, and also the EU's got rid of quotas, national quotas for farms, so that productive farms in Ireland can just produce as much as they want, for example. So there is a relative oversupply at the moment, and that will be settled by people going out of business or people having to sell up, and that is a painful situation. On the other hand, that is a situation that exists in every other market as well. So a similar thing has happened over the last 12 to 18 months in relation to oil prices. They've fallen through the floor. And as a result of that, a lot of people who work in Aberdeen and in the British oil industry have lost their jobs. But there's been very little discussion about that, very little hand-wringing about that in the media, whereas on the other hand, the threat to dairy farmers has produced an awful lot of debate. And I think that shows a certain romanticism about farming in this country, even though dairy farming in this country is breeding and growing very milk producers, mass milk producers, and then attaching them to milk extracting machines. It's not very glamorous at all, really, but we still have this romantic idea of the farmer. Secondly, there's the claim that cheap food leads to food waste, and that we produce more food than we need to because we waste it and therefore increase the environmental impact. But actually, if you look at the global problem of food waste, it's got nothing to do with that really at all. It's very much to do with underdevelopment in the developing world. Food is wasted in the fields because it can't be harvested in time, or because farmers can't store it properly, or because it can't get to market and be sold quickly enough. So, for example, in China and Vietnam, I think it's 180 million tonnes of rice is wasted each year. That's an astonishing amount of food. And so if you really want to solve that from a global perspective, you'd really have to start with the infrastructure and development over there. And also, a lot of the food that we waste over here isn't actually particularly cheap. In bag salad, which is the classic find it in the bottom of your fridge 2 weeks later kind of product, isn't particularly cheap at all. A lot of there is a problem of food waste because supermarkets turn down food that is cosmetically not suitable. But I think that ultimately consumers will pay for that. Those farms will either go out of business or they'll have to charge more in order to cope with the fact that the supermarket is turning down a proportion of their product. So we will ultimately pay for that, and it's an advantage that we can be so picky about our food that we're choosy about how it looks as well. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And the third claim problem is health. But I don't think cheapness is a very good guide to healthiness. I think thanks to the general productivity of agriculture, you can eat very, very, very cheaply and perfectly healthily. I mean, all those Hare Krishnas that live on next to nothing with their lentils and rice, I mean, they're not spending a lot of money, they're buying a lot of cheap food. So there isn't a simple correlation. And there's also lots of very unhealthy, very expensive food as well, if you want to define it in that way. I don't know how much 1,000 calories of caviar would cost, for example, but it certainly wouldn't be cheap. All that salt would probably give you a heart attack. So price is an inadequate guide to nutritional value. Let's not simply conflate cheapness with unhealthiness. To sum up, I think whatever the problems of our current food system, a bit of historical perspective says we're much better off than we were, and I don't think cheap food is a problem.
Rob, thank you very much. Can we thank our three speakers, please? Right, audience, this is what we're going to use, so questions.
I'm rather disappointed that the speakers haven't highlighted one of the key issues on this cheap food thing from the farming point of view. You've expressed a lot of sympathy for farmers, but the absolute bottom line is that our main problem is that we are not competing on a level playing field. My next door neighbour, who has a very large pig farm, in the year 2000 didn't sell a single pig because he spent the whole year removing his pig crates, which was required by UK law unilaterally. Last year, the rest of the EU followed suit. He's had 15 years of competing on an unlevel playing field. And we could go on with example after example. Milk quotas were introduced in 1984. Italy, in the year 2000, still hadn't brought in a milk quota system. And so the EU decided that to encourage them to do so, they would give them more quota. And this is the barminess of what we're coping with. And I think Alex, as a campaigning journalist, I think rather than campaigning against factory farming and large-scale dairy units, would you please take this on and investigate where we're not competing on a level playing field? And as a free marketer, Rob, it's okay to say, yeah, we've got a free market, but actually we don't have a free market because we're competing against regulation, which is not being put into practice in this country.
So who is currently paying for the price, the hidden cost of cheap food? Are we all paying equally, and if so, should that be the case? You know, if you choose to eat, for example, meat, should you be prepared to pay the hidden cost to save to the environment?
I was just going to say, as a consumer, you know, I'm not an expert. I find it quite challenging that when I go to the supermarket and I'm being told that milk is too cheap and farmers are going out of business, there's nothing I can really do about it, is there? What am I supposed to do? When I go to pay, am I supposed to say, I want to give you £1 extra for the price of milk? And I think that's the thing, we don't know as consumers what is the fair price. And there was a lot of work a few years ago with fair trade goods, you know, with kind of foreign coffee and chocolate and whatnot, but we don't seem to have that with our kind of national farmers, and I think there's work to be done there.
I'm sorry that you're so sniffy about people who go for seasonal food and local food. I'm lucky enough to live in the Vale of Glamorgan, where most of my food can be purchased within 50 or 100 miles. I also don't eat meat, which helps. I live on a very low income and I don't spend a lot on food. I'm also very concerned that we haven't touched on cheap processed food, because I believe a vast majority of the population, from what I see on television at least, seems to be dependent on not cooking. And I think this is an issue that if we ignore it, we ignore something important. The value of it, organic food, of course, is about the health of the nation. And again, please don't ignore that.
Thank you very much. Okay, speakers, quite a lot on the table.
So starting with the regulation point, I mean, I have a great deal of sympathy for that, and we were talking to DEFRA for some time around that issue and around caged hens, for example, which is another example where the UK had led the way in changing its production. Now, I think there is some responsibilities in that for food companies. So, for example, major retailers switched all of their production in line with the UK changes back in 2001 for pork, whether that was imported from Denmark, Holland, or produced here. They expected the same standard of production, and that did help drive some development actually in places like Denmark. So I think there are some questions that can be asked, but I totally agree with a fair playing field, and that applies across the supply chain as far as I'm concerned. In terms of the external costs, I think they will increasingly be picked up, even if they're not being picked up now, and the best producers are already thinking about how you adapt for the future increase in environmental taxes. So we've seen a lot of work, for example, in water and water retention, because water will undoubtedly become more expensive as we go forward. And we're seeing similar moves in carbon in terms of feed regimes and looking more closely at the emissions. Over here, in terms of the processed food, I agree with that as well. And one of the issues which I've raised consistently with the Department of Health is to challenge journalists. So I'm going to pick on Alex here, and I'm not sure whether he's ever written on this. But there is a myth that is perpetrated through the popular press that processed food is cheaper than fresh food that you can buy in a supermarket, which is patently ludicrous when you look at the prices. For example, fruit and vegetable has never been cheaper in real terms in the UK ever, period. So, you know, but the problem is a lot of people can't cook. So there is an issue there around education, which is great to see it's come back on the syllabus now for years 5 and 6, I think, for the first time in a number of years. So there are some issues there, but the first myth we have to get over to consumers is it's actually cheaper to cook from scratch than it is to buy processed food. Now, we need to help people to make that transition, but that is, that is the way forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Alex, do you want to pick up on anything?
I mean, on the pig farm issue, I think and I do speak to pig farmers, and I'm well aware that at the rate at which they're going out of business for all sorts of factors, but I'd say the low price of bacon is one of them. But the one pig farmer I know very, very well, and others have supported him, would say that one of the chief problems over the welfare issue, and it's absolutely right that Europe spent a very long time enforcing individual countries to follow the higher welfare standards that British pig farmers implemented very early, is that the retailers promised British pig farmers when this first happened that they would support them, that they would buy their bacon, and they didn't. And the British retailers were left out to hang.
No,
and we went on.
But that wasn't true.
Well,
Alex. They said they would support the same standards, is what they said.
But you didn't back it with the money, and you went on, and you can go into any supermarket in the land and buy economy rubbish bacon imported from Europe at lower standards, and that remained the case throughout. And that's actually why so many British pig farmers have now hung up their boots and don't do it any longer. But just briefly on the wider issue of level playing fields and free markets, it's absolute nonsense to imagine that government has removed itself from food price control. Government is totally implicated in controlling the prices of food in Britain because of this decision, and I think it's lamentable, though now impossible to turn back, to support the retailers with enormous subsidy. At Sainsbury's, the low price, the low paid worker at Sainsbury's, sorry, no, look at the statistics so differently. So the four biggest supermarkets, their low paid workers are supported by the state, by us, the taxpayers, to the tune of £1 billion a year in welfare and tax benefits. Sainsbury's paid less in corporation tax last year than the government handed out to its workers to support their incomes till they arrived at a point where they could feed their families. We, because British food retail has got government absolutely in an arm lock because it terrified of food price inflation. We pay to have food prices low. So in the end, you ask to what extent we, the middle class, are paying for low food prices. We do it through our taxes. 11 billion a year to support retail workers, low-paid retail workers, comes out of taxes.
Alex, do you want to just have a go? There was a woman that just asked a question, because milk's a thing you raised.
The higher price.
What would one do if one was concerned?
I mean, it's very hard. It's very hard because one of the effects of this support of big-style retail means there are very few small retailers left. I mean, there are a few actually in the poorer places in Britain that you go to. I live in Leith in Edinburgh. You can still find individual retailers, so that's a boon. But the choice offered to you is ridiculously limited. I mean, yes, buy organic milk. I mean, that at least will be a higher price, and that certain standards will have been followed that aren't followed in bog standard milk production. I've got a lot of arguments with organic, but the farmer will be getting a better price and his workers will be paid better.
Okay. Andrew, I'll let you come back on. You also wanted to come back to what I was saying.
Sure,
I just want to give Rob an opportunity to respond to anything from that first round of questions.
Well, there's quite a few, but on the first point about the regulation, again, I completely agree, and I think that actually we should go a lot further in just getting government out of the food production, in fact, any production. So, for me, I would like to see far fewer regulations, more uniformly enforced, but also far fewer subsidies. In fact, let's get rid of subsidies altogether so that we can actually, society more generally can actually properly price and value what we're producing at the moment. At the moment, it's all skewed by subsidies for trimming your hedges and cutting your grass at certain times of year, and all sorts of weird stuff goes on. And I talked to a dairy farmer a few years ago, and it was just like kind of tearing his hair out at some of the kind of more sort of Byzantine stewardship rules that he's kind of forced to deal with to actually earn this money. I'm not getting snotty about people eating local or organic or whatever. It's entirely up to you what you choose. If you want to eat seasonal food all the time, that's absolutely fine. It's when people who make those choices insist that they are being moral and that actually that everyone should do that, then I take umbrage at that, and I think that that's unnecessary. I think that I think the food system we've got is very good, actually, at producing food very cheaply and actually with not huge amounts of environmental damage. I think that is greatly overblown, and I think that it's a system it's a work in progress in the sense that whenever we learn about new things that we're doing that maybe we shouldn't be doing, we learn how to clean them up, use less fertilizer, and so on and so forth. It's all very experimental. We're learning as we go along about how to make agriculture more efficient. And I think that we don't need to jump in with, sort of outside standards like local or organic or seasonal, because I think that just gets in the way of things. In terms of I'll have a bash at the subsidisation of low-paid workers. I mean, that was stuff that was brought in by a Labour government to try and make it easier to get into work without having the welfare trap of earning less or very little more when you went into work compared to when you had benefits. That's probably gone too far. And it's interesting that the current government is trying to unwind that a bit and raise the national minimum wage instead. Be interesting to see how that pans out. But it was all done for good intentions and not just to subsidise supermarkets.
Okay. Andrew, so you're not supporting British farmers, apparently?
Yeah, so I just wanted to pick up this because obviously we've spoken quite a lot about dairy farmers. I mean, the reason that I do believe that the global market has a big impact on dairy farmers, if you wind back 2 years ago when dairy farm gate prices were almost a historic high, the National Farmers Union, who I was meeting quite regularly then, was telling me this is down to global factors and this is great news for farmers. And in fact, they were telling farmers to increase production because the global market wants our milk and our dairy products out there. Now, 2 years on, the price drops. Suddenly it becomes retailers' fault and people are in retailers' premises saying that they're at fault. I don't buy that as an argument because actually I don't think they can be so opposite that you can have 2 years ago when we've got very high prices, that's due to global markets, but 2 years on when there's a low price, that's all down to retailers. It patently isn't the fact. But also what isn't the fact is actually if you look at the Dairy UK, which is the Farmers Levy Board, which puts out statistics, and you look at their league table of milk price, i.e. what price companies pay, the top 10 prices for milk in this country are paid by retailers. Now, the problem for farmers isn't liquid milk, and if you speak to farmers, they would recognise that. The problem is the products that they make from liquid milk, which is about half of their production. So only the half of their production that comes out of the cow ends up on a shelf and we drink as liquid milk or in our hospitals or in our schools, wherever it is. The rest of it gets made into cheese, butter, skim milk, powder, things that are easily exportable around the world. And when you're in that market, you're at the whim of the global market, and therefore that price will have a key influence on what the farmers and the dairy processors are going to get for it.
We import these things, we don't export them.
We import and we export.
No, we import 60% of our butter.
Well, I don't know where you get these figures from, Alex, because I asked our major retailers, because I've just written the evidence for the EFRA committee this week. So I asked them, just let me finish, so I just asked them to give me the percentage of sourcing for butter, milk, cream, all of those figures. And I don't know where you get this 60%. Butter, 85%. Cheese, hard cheese, which is the main cheese we buy, 95%. Milk and cream, 100% sourced here. So it may be coming in, but it's not going through retailers.
Lurpak and Anchor butter. Between them, they have 60% of the market. Lurpak from Denmark, Anchor from New Zealand. I mean, it's pretty simple. The figures are there on any supermarket.
Well, they're not. Yeah, they are, but those are branded. Those are branded products, Alex. What I'm talking about is the influence that a retailer has. They could choose to buy all their butter from Ireland if they wanted, and sell it as their own brand. They don't. Okay. And actually, own brand has a very high penetration in terms of dairy products on shelves.
Alex, you were scoffing at Rob's point about dairy farmers being glorified hedge trimmers. Don't know if you want to come back on that, or I might just pick
well, I think, I mean, when I, it's not scoffing.
Not scoffing, I didn't mean
milder than that. But I think the point, you know, I agree with you about the twisting, market distorting nature of the subsidy regime. But you say you'd like to have all subsidies removed. But that is the end of cheap food. If you include in subsidy the fact that every agricultural worker is receiving benefits and welfare payments and tax benefits and so on, cheap food is over. I mean, I don't know what percentage. If you removed all subsidies from retail and food production, food up to 20% of income, I don't know. I mean, it would be enormous. I don't think it's untangleable. And the only other point, very briefly, on environmental damage, I think, you know, you're right. The environmental damage of modern farming is exaggerated here, but that's because we export the damage. The damage is in Brazil, where where rainforest is cut down to feed British cows, and the soy is brought in. We don't see it here because we get poor people to carry the damage for us.
Do you want to come back on that quickly, Rob, before I go?
No, that's good.
Okay, so audience, there were lots of head shaking when those contributions were being made.
Thank you. I'll declare an interest in that I work with Andrew at the British Retail Consortium. And one of the things I concentrate on is the broader tax regime. And therefore, Alex, I really need to take issue with the idea that government is subsidising in any way retail sector and supermarkets. Once you, I don't actually agree necessarily about the subsidisation against tax credits either, but that aside, the retail sector does not benefit from corporation tax, the low corporation tax that we have in the UK, because margins are so tiny. It's actually banking or services that benefit from that. But more importantly, because most retailers are property-based, they pay more disproportionately, so much more in business rates than anybody else. So if government really wanted to subsidise supermarkets, they would cut business rates. And I've spent the last 3 years of my life campaigning for them to do that, and they're not showing any sign of doing that at all. And just finally on the whole tax credit question, actually if you look at the figures about who's receiving tax credits, most of those people are not the primary earners in a household, so it's not quite as simple as you're making out.
Hi, I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts about making connections between cheap food and unhealthy food, which has been touched on. And we've had a lot in the news recently about putting additional charges on what's unnecessary unhealthy food, like soft drinks and that sort of thing. Be interested to know what you think about that.
Hi, we haven't heard much about this, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts on the connection between cheap food and animal welfare, because as far as I can tell, animal welfare has increased over the last few decades, at the same time that food prices have decreased, and I just wondered how you thought that came about.
I'm kind of looking at Rob, but because I don't know anything about the economy of food. But so this is more a utopian thing, which could, I guess, the moral food people could get into. But what if you go to the zoo and you get to feed the penguins for a day? This is not my idea, somebody else's idea. There's one menu, there's one food system that they eat, and the same with probably all the animals in the zoo. They can't have a bit of everything. So what if we had one food system that was right for us, and the shops made food commensurate with that? Did that make sense? Sorry. Okay. But like, if there's one menu for us, could the retail, and that sort of verges on the moral or fact. Is there a fact about what we're meant to eat? Okay. And could that, yeah.
I disagree with the point about it not mattering whether food is local or not, because I think the more that the consumer wants food from places like South America, the other side of the world, the more air miles, the more carbon emissions, the more impact it's going to have on climate change and the environment and our food security. So I don't think I agree with that.
Okay. I'll come back to the speakers.
What I do know is that we are omnivores and that we can eat a very, very wide range of foods, and actually in different places, different societies eat quite different narrow diets and prove to be just as healthy as each other. So that's one of the advantages of human beings. We're very adaptable, and the idea that we go in and get the same menu every day from the supermarket would be horrible. I mean, some people have taken this to extreme. So there's a product in America called Soylent, yes. Which is a powdered complete food. Actually, there's a British version come out now called Huel, which sounds far too much like hurl to me. But it's the same. You mix it with water, and that's your food for the day. It's got all the vitamins and minerals and whatever. And if you want to do that, that's fine. I can't imagine anything worse. Devoid of the pleasure of food. That's one of the great things about food, is now that we don't have to worry about getting enough of it, we can play around with enjoying the flavours of it and argue about what's good food and what's not from that point of view. Aesthetic arguments are very happy to be relativistic about, but not about the benefits of cheap food. In terms of, Andrew made this point earlier, so I want to come back to it about the processed food. I don't think there's a problem with people not cooking. If they don't want to cook, they don't need to cook. I know many stay-at-home mothers who are absolutely sick of cooking now, and I would love to be able to afford to eat ready meals every night, or a decent quality of ready meal. So once cooking becomes a chore, I just think, I can see why people are willing to pay for the added convenience of it. And I don't think it's by any means necessarily unhealthy to do so. And if people do want to cook, the food's there in the supermarket. You walk in, all you see is fruit and veg and then fresh meat and whatever. All the food is there, all the ingredients are there, and there are so many cookbooks out there in the bestsellers list that there's many different things you can cook in order to enjoy food. So there's no problems there. Local food, I think the air miles thing is a complete red herring. If you actually were concerned about carbon emissions, the vast majority of the emissions related to food are in the actual production of it. So, for example, there's fewer carbon emissions from, for example, a famous example is lamb from New Zealand, sunny, lots of grass, you can freeze it and then bring it over, whereas if you have to do that in the UK, you'll have to grow crops for some of the year to feed those sheep, or maybe even have to bring them inside in heated areas and bring it, so that potentially the emissions, even though it's local, are higher than for importing from New Zealand. Same for things like tomatoes, for example. In Spain, you can just grow them under the sun. In Britain, you have to probably grow them onto polythene with heating. So once you take a broader aspect of that, actually a world market in food is quite handy.
Okay. Alex, you don't have to cover everything, but you're very welcome to if you want to.
I think, on universal, I'm as partial to a pizza as anyone else. And universal food systems, we're diverse people, and part of loving food is loving its diversity. There's one of those rather dictatorial American food philosophers, Michael Pollan, and most foodies worship at his in front of his books daily. And he said some quite sensible things. He said the lesson is eat food, real food, not too much, and mainly plants, which is sort of makes a bit of sense. But and I quite like that one. But then he then also said, don't eat anything your grandmother wouldn't recognise. And I remember my dear grandmother, who used to take us swimming and buy us Scottish meat pies, which was a very processed food, and she loved cheesy Wotsits as well. So I don't think that goes down at all. I like cheesy Wotsits too. So I don't think universal systems do work. I mean, I do think getting back to understanding where food comes from, that children should understand that, how it's made and so on, what happens to an animal when it's turned into meat. These are things that people ought to know, and that would be healthy. I think, just to pick up on two other small points, I'm not aware, I wrote a book about meat and the cost, the changing production systems of meat, and I'm a carnivore, I like eating meat, but I only eat expensive meat, I have to say. I think cheap meat is a bad. I'm not aware of anyone who's said that animal welfare has increased. I think, there's a lot of hysteria in that debate, but go into an abattoir, as I have, or go into a modern factory farm, and it would be quite hard to say those animals are better off than they were when they were on the farmyard. But that's not possible. It can't happen any longer. And finally, the lady from the BRC, I'm absolutely fascinated. She said, no government subsidy of the retail system whatsoever. Well, that's an extraordinary statement, and maybe we should take it up later, but I can't see it myself. I would point out, going back to that survey of the cost to the taxpayer of subsidising low-paid workers, and 2/3 of retail workers are low-paid, according to the Labour Force survey. And the figures that were published earlier this year by the citizensuk.org, which no doubt is not a totally impartial organisation, but anyway, they said that Tesco in 2014, they calculated the benefits paid to enable its low-paid workers totaled 364 million, over 1/3 of a billion, while the corporation tax paid by Tesco, which is not, of course, the only tax it pays, was 519 million. Now, I cannot see that, given that those workers could not afford to work at Tesco without the subsidy from the state, that is not just giving 364 million straight from the taxpayer into Tesco's coffers.
Andrew.
I slightly differ with Alex around the welfare. I think there have been, if you look at the regulatory environment over welfare, now there's a point probably to be had about how well enforced it is, which I probably would agree. We've heard earlier about the lack of consistency across the EU where most of the regulation comes. I think there has been an increase. And there's certainly been an increase in awareness of animal welfare issues amongst consumers. So if you look at issues which would be on a retailer's agenda, sustainability would be way up there now, ethical labour and animal welfare. And actually some animal welfare products held up pretty well, even during the recession of sort of 2008 onwards. And the growth of products like Freedom Foods and Free Range and various other things that we've seen and continue to see, I think does show that there's more consumer awareness. I agree with Alex. I would actually like to see a better awareness amongst consumers around where our food comes from, but I think we also have to be realistic about it. I mean, we've probably got quite an educated audience here. There's 60 million odd people out there, you know, and most people, for them, food at the right price is all they want, and that's all they're interested in, and that's fine as well. As long as they have all the information to be able to make that choice, that's fine, and that's what we should be delivering for them as well.
Final thoughts from the audience, and I'll come back for the speakers.
As far as I'm concerned, you can't blame the retailers. At the end of the day, the retailers would love to pay more tax. They'd love to pay more salaries and wages. And if you're suggesting that people's wages are subsidised by benefits, there are probably millions of people in all sorts of industries. The fault is ours. The public who sit here, they'll go to Aldi because it's cheaper. Don't blame the retailer.
I guess as an extension of the point that was just made, it feels a bit disingenuous to say that we're subsidising retailers. That's a product of we subsidise all low-paid workers because we want them to have a good quality of life. Has Tesco given them, you know, have they reduced the wages since the tax credits were brought in? If that's the case, then I can kind of see your argument. If their quality of life has just got better because they're getting more money with the same amount of wages, I don't buy it as a subsidy. I buy it as the, you know, intended consequence of tax credits.
Your final thoughts both about the debate as a whole and anything that's just come up.
The retail subsidy thing's starting to get a bit technical, but my question would be exactly that one. You know, let's look at the actual figures. Was there a change in wages? I doubt it. I think that this was additional income to low-paid workers. I think I would go back to the points that were being made right at the very start. If you were to look now from the point of view of 1936. That's when a report by Sir John Boyd Orr was produced for the British government about the state of the health of nutrition in the UK. And John Boyd Orr, admittedly sort of in the immediate aftermath of the Great Depression, found that over 50% of the population couldn't afford to feed themselves to the standard that the government then regarded as necessary, you know, through medical science and nutritional science. What was necessary. 50% of the population couldn't do it. And that would be a tiny fraction of that now. And the vast majority of us eat not just enough, not just nutritionally enough, but of an enormous range and convenience. And I think that in those terms, I think that the food system that we've got, while it does have some flaws still, I think it's a huge achievement, and that we should never ever become blasé about cheap food and what a benefit it has been to the whole of society.
Thank you, Rob. Andrew, final thoughts?
I mean, I'd certainly agree with. I think it has been one of the huge success stories that we've seen, and for me also, it's been a fantastic example in how democracy works, because actually there is no more democratic system than our food supply chain. So if you look at the changes, if you look at our own supermarket sector 5 years ago, when the discounters were, you know, a relatively small share, and where they are today, that has all been driven by consumers, by us as consumers choosing where and what we want to buy. It is the one supply chain, the one system that we truly can influence, and we influence it every day. And for me, if only other markets worked as effectively as our food supply chain, I think we'd all be in a better place than we are today.
Thank you, Andrew. And Alex, I think you deserve the final word.
Thanks. Well, I mean, you know, as I said at the beginning, you know, it is a golden age for anyone who likes food, and that is 99% of us. And it's a wonderful thing that we and those who went before us have managed to, you know, construct a country where people do not live by and large in fear of hunger or suffer from the diseases of food poverty. They are obviously suffering from some of the diseases of food wealth, which or wealth of calories. And I live in Scotland, and we have the fattest people and the highest rates of young type 2 diabetes in Europe, and that's a very serious challenge. But we're better off. It's true. I think where I differ from you two is that I am no longer convinced it's sustainable. I think we're living through a time of artificially cheap food, and that changing factors globally and within this country means that will be over. Food prices will have to rise, and that could in some ways be a good thing if controlled properly and if the poor are sheltered from it. But with this, the unregulated system and this sort of slavish view of government that food price inflation must be kept down at all costs, when these rises, when the pressures build come, things are going to get nasty. And we could do it better.